Good morning, Nerdfighteria. It's Thursday, July 14th. I hope you're doing very well today. It's me, Symphing12. Today, I'm gonna discuss the instruments of the orchestra, the most commonly used ones. So, sorry percussionists, we're not gonna cover most of your instruments. And since this is an educational video, you can dock me on time as long as it's within the 10-minute mark. Let's see if I can do it. We start today at the top of the score. Now, there is actually a standardized layout for the instruments in a specific order so that way the conductor knows where to find each instrument when they're looking for a particular musical line. At the top of the score we find the flute and the piccolo. There's usually 2 to 3 flutes, we're going to act as if there are 3 of each woodwind in this video, and 1 piccolo. They actually are some of the highest pitched instruments in the orchestra, and the piccolo is the most high pitched of all of them. I mean, this thing can play ridiculously high. It's really, really good as long as you know how to use it correctly, because otherwise it can really drown everyone else out. When the piccolo plays, you'll hear it. The flute, of course, is our standard flute, a very common instrument. Has a very sweet sound in the middle register, which unfortunately I think is underutilized as a composer. And then, of course, the soaring high register is just beautiful. The next set of instruments in the woodwind section are your oboes. So the oboe is another soprano instrument, and it's not an instrument that likes to blend. Much like the piccolo, you'll hear it. Generally, you'll find about 3 oboes, 2 or 3, and then there's a lower auxiliary called the cor anglais, or the English horn. It goes a little bit lower, extends the range of the oboe while maintaining more or less the same kind of oboe-like sound before sounding too much like a bassoon, which we'll get to. The next set of instruments we come to is a large family of instruments. Thankfully, only a few of these are used in the orchestra regularly. And this is the clarinet family, which is the newest woodwind family to join the orchestra. The soprano clarinet, which is your standard, is either in B flat or in A, and that's just for key reasons. You'd pick one over the other. It's usually in pairs or in threes. It has a warm sound and a huge range. Compared to the flute and the oboe, the clarinet, standard clarinet, has a really, really wide range. So it's a really versatile instrument as well. Unlike the flute and the oboe, which have generally 1 auxiliary, the piccolo and the cor anglais, the clarinet usually has 2, if not more. You'll often see the E-flat clarinet, which is a smaller sopranino size instrument, as well as the B-flat bass clarinet, which only comes in B-flat, and extends the range down. And then in more recent years, you'll find either the great bass in E-flat, which is sometimes called the contralto, but that's a brand name, and then the true B-flat contrabass clarinet, which really extend the range of the clarinets way down. Which brings us to the next group of instruments, and that's the bassoon. The bassoon traditionally played the bass lines, but these days it really functions as its own section. Symph from the future here. What I meant to say was that the bassoon tends to play in the upper register these days. Again, these usually come in either pairs or threes, and are usually joined by the double bassoon, or the contrabassoon, which, again, is a really humongous tube that plays some of my favorite notes in the entire ensemble. It's got the reediest, woodiest sound of all the instruments, in my opinion. And as a double bass player, it's one of my favorites to play with, because we often play the same parts. So that's the woodwinds. So we're now going to talk about the brass. The horns are actually the first to show up in the brass section, right below the contrabassoon. There's usually 4 horns in an orchestra. There are historical reasons for this, but 4 horns is the standard, with the first playing the highest, the third playing the second highest. The second horn actually plays lower than the third, and then the 4th horn brings up the bottom. Following them, we have a different set of instruments. The horns have a really mellow sound, which blends really well with a number of instruments, whereas the rest of these, which are called the heavy brass, tend to be very, very bombastic and loud and really strong, powerful instruments. This is the group that includes the trumpets, usually which number in 2s or 3s, the trombones, which usually number in 3s, and the tuba, there's only 1 because it's a loud instrument. We'll talk about the trumpets first because they're the first to show up in the score order here. Trumpets are, well, trumpets. They're loud, they're shiny sounding instruments which, again, like a lot of the high woodwinds, can penetrate pretty much any texture you ask them to. Which brings us to the next group of instruments, which can do the same thing if you're not careful, and that's the trombones. But the trombone is unique among the brass that it's the only one that has always been able to play chromatically, so it can play all the notes, all the white and black keys of a piano, because the horn and the trumpet couldn't do this and the tuba was invented afterward. And it's the only one that has a slide as opposed to valves. That famous wah, 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 is usually played on a trombone. And I'm mimicking the slide with my hand here. I don't play trombone. There's usually 2 tenor trombones, and one bass trombone, which all share the same range, but the bass trombone shines a little bit better in the low register. It can play some of those notes a little bit cleaner because it has some extra tubing. The true contrabass trombone, which would be an octave lower, is just impractical. So its parts are usually played on our final brass instrument here, which is the tuba. And the tuba either comes as a bass or contrabass tuba, and this instrument gives a really round sound that can, again, drown everything else out if it's not used judiciously. And that's why you generally only see one tuba in a huge orchestra of over 100. It's still one tuba, because that thing can really, really pack a punch. So we've covered the wind instruments now, the woodwinds and the brass. The next thing we see, if you're looking at the score, is the massive percussion section. I'm not covering most of the percussion instruments you might see. The most common instrument in the percussion section is the timpani. Timpani indicates plural. There's usually at least two. The timpani are the leaders of the percussion section. They kind of straddle the bridge between being a bass instrument and a percussion instrument, although they're definitely more the latter than the former. And these instruments are a large brass kettle with a skin on top that can be tuned to a pitch. This is an instrument that you can actually discern the pitch of. Not all percussion instruments share this distinction. For example, the bass drum, the snare drum, the tenor drum, the field drum, all of which are very similar instruments, usually are not tuned to any particular note. They're just tuned to sound, in tune with itself, but not necessarily playing a specific note. There's also other instruments of definite pitch, though. You have marimbas, you have xylophones, vibraphones, all sorts of glockenspiel is another really common one. The celeste, which is a keyboard instrument, but inside the mechanism is a bunch of metal bars that are hit with hammers, much like a piano, but with metal bars instead of strings. So it sounds kind of like a vibraphone. It's a little more versatile. If you've ever heard the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from The Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky, it uses that instrument in it. Again, the percussion cohort is huge. You could have a wide variety of instruments in there, some of which can also just be literal toys, like little bicycle horns and stuff. That usually falls in the jurisdiction of the percussion section. Which brings me to the next section of instruments. I know we're really flying by. Again, we have no choice with the time limit. The next set of instruments are a little bit weird. They don't really fall into any one category. This is really I call this the miscellaneous group. This is where instruments who are visiting the orchestra or maybe are used in a less usual setting might show up. So these instruments include the piano, the harpsichord, the organ, a bunch of keyboard instruments, and they tend to show up between the percussion and the strings, as does the harp, which is actually a string instrument. The strings themselves are actually at the bottom of this whole thing, even though they're the ones who often have the most material and are often the defining sound of an orchestra. The strings, of course, are your violins divided into two sections, usually roughly equal: the violas, the cellos, and the double basses. The strings are usually played with a bow, as opposed to plucked with the fingers, although that is also a technique that is used on these instruments to give a really short percussive sound as opposed to that long sustained sound that you often associate with the string family in the orchestra. This is also the most numerous group. One string instrument isn't particularly powerful, so you tend to have about 10 violins in each section. So 20 altogether, but 10 in the first violins, 10 in the second. Maybe about 8 violas, maybe 6 cellos, and 4 double basses. And that's a small orchestra right there. That is small. Whew! We've covered a lot of information in not very much time. I know, it can be overwhelming. If you ever have any questions, you can find me in the Nerdfighteria Discord. I hope that you've gotten a rough idea of the instruments that you find in the orchestra, and a rough idea of how they sound, so you might listen for one in a particular piece of music. These are all instruments that are used in film music, in concert music, all sorts of stuff, even video game music these days. I hope you're having a happy Pizzamas in July. TFTBA, Nerdfighter!